I want to let everyone know, you may have just heard that we will be recording the session for today. And so the main thing we ask everybody, if you can, is to keep your microphones muted throughout so we don't have any background noise. And then we'll definitely hold space at the end of this for some Q&A. So just want to get started and welcome all of you to today's Whitburn+WisACT Wednesday event. My name is Sam Larson. I'm the interim director of the Whitburn Center for Governance and Policy Research at UW-Oshkosh. And the Whitburn Center was established back in 2021 with a generous donation from our founding benefactor, Jerry Whitburn, who served on the University of Wisconsin System Board of Regents for a number of years. I want to tell you a little bit about our gathering today. It's the second in our newly launched monthly series. It's hosted by the Whitburn Center in partnership with the Wisconsin Alliance for Civic Trust, also known as WisACT. And so the Whitburn recently assumed leadership of this initiative, which was founded by this cross-partisan team that included former Republican Governor Scott McCallum and retired Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel journalist senior editor David Haynes. So WisACT, just so folks are aware, it's grounded in really three principles: promoting trust in our political system and in society at large, one; two, supporting fair, safe, and secure elections, and then third, encouraging peaceful engagement across the political and really social spectrum. And that's something that I'm excited about for today's talk. Our monthly event series also, I think it's important to highlight that really what we want to do is foster conversation across political and social differences, and then also share cutting edge research and reflect on some of the most urgent challenges that we are all facing right now. My hope is that these conversations can also lead us to some of the most innovative solutions for the challenges we're facing right now as well. So as a longtime fan of documentary film, I am very, very, very excited for our discussion today in the virtual space, Join or Die, a conversation with documentary co-director Pete Davis on rebuilding community in Wisconsin and beyond. And Paul Van Auken will be our moderator for today's discussion. So I want to hand things over to Paul. We're also glad you're here, and I'm just very excited for today's event. Thank you all so much.
Thanks, Sam. Hi, everyone. Really glad you're here. And I'm excited for this conversation too. We're going to start with some brief introductions, and I'm just going to give a few opening thoughts and mainly just to introduce some concepts that might be important here. But I'll start with introductions. Pete Davis is a writer and civic advocate in Baltimore. He's the co-founder of the Democracy Policy Network, a policy group focused on raising up ideas that deepen democracy, the co-director of Join or Die, a documentary on community in America, and the author of Dedicated, the case for commitment in an age of infinite browsing. Thanks for being here, Pete.
So glad to be here.
We also have Miranda Spindt, who is a Will Policy Associate. She assists the policy team with research, writing, and legislative efforts in multiple policy areas, especially healthcare and other social issues where ideas rooted in individual liberty and free markets are needed for policymakers. She holds a BA in both political science and economics from Marquette University and an MPA with a concentration in policy analysis and analytics from Norwich University. Thanks for being here, Miranda.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I'm excited for the discussion today.
Excellent. We also have Amanda Pierron, who is a McNair Scholar and senior undergrad at UW-Oshkosh, majored in political science and broad field social science education. She has experience teaching middle school civics and working in political mobilization nonprofits. Her undergraduate research focuses on feminist movement mobilization in the Midwest and globally. She's currently a summer research intern with the Whitburn Center, working for us, which is great. Thanks, Amanda.
Thank you.
And then we have Aspyn Rafac, who is a Chumash native, first-gen scholar, and a senior at UWO, Oshkosh, that is, majoring in political science with a minor in law and policy and certificates in Spanish and Indigenous studies. Also a McNair Scholar, Aspyn has research interests in restorative justice, tribal law and policy, and global development. They are a research intern at the Whitburn Center, working with us, and also at a local church where they educate youth on the intersection between faith and social justice. Thanks for being here, Aspyn.
Thank you.
And I'm, like Sam said, I'm Paul Van Auken, a professor of sociology and environmental studies here at UW Oshkosh and new WisACT coordinator for the Whitburn Center. Prior to jumping into our panel discussion, I'm going to briefly touch on some ideas and concepts to help lay the foundation for our conversation about rebuilding community in Wisconsin and beyond. Starting with, what is community? That's a tough question. I'm not going to try to answer it because there are innumerable uses of the term and dozens of academic definitions. But it's been kind of one of my projects to try to get a little bit more refined in terms of what community is. So I'll just throw out a definition that can, or a way of thinking about it, at least that might be helpful for today. A sociological perspective that sees community as an inclusive web of interconnected, action-oriented relationships that develops in particular places and times through a process of repeated social interaction around issues of common concern. Its full expression should produce a sense of community and solidarity that can be celebrated, as well as a variety of outcomes related to social well-being, but its emergence is not a given by any stretch, and its full expression is elusive. A related idea that is important to this conversation is social capital. Broadly, networks, norms, and trust that facilitate coordination and cooperation. Social capital has been broken down into at least three types. Bonding capital, which is produced through interactions among similar people and important to day-to-day activities and life of individuals at the micro level, the level of face-to-face interaction. Bridging capital is also the second type, which is produced through interactions among people from different backgrounds and social positions, which is important for bigger picture advances and formation of community and happens more at the meso or the medium level of society. The third type is linking capital, which is produced through interactions between local people and groups and higher level organizations like state agencies, which helps to produce political capital, giving people a seat at the table along with actors from powerful institutions of the market, state, and civil society. So this is more at the meso or even at the macro level, at the largest level of society. Some sociologists have argued that while marginalized groups often lack access to bridging and linking capital, which can be key causes of socioeconomic inequality, their strong bonding among marginalized people can produce organic capital and community cultural wealth that is generally only recognized on the inside. So that's important to recognize too, this area that's kind of left out of the discussion oftentimes. As alluded to, social capital can be understood as a building block to a number of other related outcomes, including the formation of community. What is it that needs to be rebuilt? According to Robert Putnam, who we'll hear more about soon from Pete, political polarization and socioeconomic inequality are very high, and social connectedness is very low in the US, which was also true about 100 years ago, before this whole thing flipped in the mid-20th century and then flipped again in the last several decades. An excerpt from sociologist Arlie Hochschild's guest piece in the New York Times from 2 weeks ago that is broadly about this topic notes that Democrats need to understand that the deeper problem is that we're socially hollowed out. That happy buzz of community life, that's not here. There are fewer meetings of the Masons, the Rotary Club, the Red Hatters. Our church benches are empty. Here, there's no safe place against drugs. One elderly woman told me, I don't open up my door anymore. I've heard teens say there's nothing to do. A lot of kids are alone in their rooms online. I think mega plays to a social desert. That's one argument, but it's clear that not only Democrats are concerned, as exemplified, among other things, by the recent study of social capital in Wisconsin by the Wisconsin Institute for Law and Liberty, a conservative libertarian public interest law firm, which we'll hear more about soon. Okay, with that foundation laid, we're now going to turn to the film Join or Die. And before we ask co-director Pete Davis to tell us more about it and his team's ongoing efforts across the US, we're going to view the trailer in the event that you haven't yet seen the film. I don't think are we getting sound, Amanda? I think you need to unmute yourself, maybe. Is that it?
Of course, we get sound when I test it before, but not now. Okay.
This is Bob.
There we go.
Bob's a big fan of clubs.
I belong to everything. That's my high school bowling team. I'm the tall one in the middle.
And this is a film about why you should join one. How Bob discovered
that the fate of America depends on it.
Harvard professor and award-winning writer Robert Putnam.
You've been described as the poet laureate of civil society.
Robert D. Putnam, for deepening our understanding of community in America.
He made people pay attention to a concept that most people had never paid attention to.
Social capital, social capital, social capital, social networks have value.
I'd like to call on Professor Robert Putnam, who gave us the concept of social capital.
Number of people who know one another's first name, the number of people who take part in community organizations, the level of trust and reciprocity in the community.
The places that have better government are the places that have a long history of social networks and social capital.
Chances of dying over the next year are cut in half by joining one group.
Bowling Alone. Where'd you get the title?
Well, I happened to run into a friend who owned a bowling alley, and he said, "Gosh, Bob, you don't know it, but you stumble onto the major economic problems facing my industry. Because although more Americans are bowling than ever before, bowling is up in America. Bowling in leagues, bowling in teams is off by about 60%. Everything reflects connections with other people are going down. How many times last year did you go to church? Down. How many times did you go to a dinner party? Down. How many times last year did you go to a club meeting? In barely a couple of decades, half all the civic infrastructure in America had simply vanished. It's equivalent to saying half of all the roads in America just disappeared.
Everyone has a feeling something's happening, but then he's got charts to actually show what's actually happening.
Whatever's happening to people's sense of mutual obligation, to their understanding about the common good, to their willingness to trust their neighbor, is no longer going on because people are bowling alone.
The book Bowling Alone, which you're familiar with by Robert Putnam.
The activity may still be going on, but there's no social capital being built. That decreases the trust we have in one another. How lonely Americans are, how divided.
You know, he may have been onto something.
We have to see loneliness as a threat to our health security and to our overall national security.
We are trying something that hasn't been done, just growing and sustaining a multiracial democracy.
Politics and policy ultimately depends on the social health of our country.
Organization, connections with other people is the only way you get big change.
Democracy is a pain in the ass. If it was just easy, no one would have to go to a meeting and it would all just be fair and easy. You should join, your kids should join, and if there's not an organization you want to join, create one.
America doesn't have to be the government your whole life. You would decide change history.
And in case you missed it, the film is available on Netflix, and you can also rent it in some places that we can share more information about later. But Pete, can you just sort of tell us a bit about the origin of the film and what your overall project with it is?
Thank you so much. Thanks so much for watching. I hope some of you can check out the film. So glad to be talking with you all. I've heard so many of you are great community builders. You know, I made this film with my sister, Rebecca Davis, and it came out of two streams in our life. In her life, she was a video journalist traveling all around the country, seeing the symptoms of community decline. So she was seeing towns that had opioid epidemic issues, that had teen anxiety and depression issues, where veterans were coming home and not reintegrating into their community, where, you know, national politics was ripping a town apart. And she was really hungry for the answer to what is at the root of this all. You know, Henry David Thoreau said there are 1,000 striking at the branches of evil to one who is striking at the root. And so she was really hungry for looking for what's behind all this sense that our country's falling apart. Meanwhile, I had been in Bob Putnam's class, and the class was a total revelation, which is that I was a young political science student, young politico. I thought democracy and politics was all about what happened in DC. It was all about the White House and the Senate and the Supreme Court and maybe international treaties or the Fed or something like that. And what Bob said was actually the foundation of our democracy, the most important locus of politics in American life, is actually in your neighborhood across the country. You know, ordinary neighbor-to-neighbor interactions, ordinary civic associations, clubs, and that this is what is actually the foundation of our democracy. And when that goes away, that's when you start having downstream effects. And so the canary in the coal mine for a democratic crisis is not what we're seeing today, which is the symptoms of the democratic crisis. It's what might have happened 20 years ago, which is, and over the last 50 years, which is the decline of this ordinary community and civic life. And so that was, totally a revelation for me. And that was the, answer to what was at the source of so many of these problems that we felt was the most compelling. And most importantly, it was the answer to what was going to get us out of this mess, which was not just treating the symptoms and saying, oh, this particular politician is everything that's wrong, or this particular trend is everything that's wrong. But actually, the way we're going to be a healthy democracy 50 years from now is if we start now rebuilding civic life and community life in America. And so we wanted to make a movie that captured that. And we wanted to get it down to a really simple idea. And that's why we called it Join or Die, which is, and our tagline is, this is a film about why you should join a club and why the fate of America depends on it. And we really believe that act of joining is the central act of a citizen in a democracy, coming together with your neighbors to do something together. From the goofiest thing like a pickleball league to the most serious thing like fighting City Hall or fighting climate change or whatever cause you care about. It all starts with coming together with your neighbors, and that's what we made this film about, and that's why we've been touring it around the country the last few years, trying to start conversations just like this one about the importance of joining in community.
Excellent. Thanks, Pete, and we'll look forward to hearing more about what you've learned through that. Miranda, can you please explain why Will decided to study social capital here in Wisconsin?
Sure. So just a little overview. So Will is a nonprofit law and policy center based in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. We are committed to free markets, individual liberties, limited government, and then we further those values through our litigation, legislative, and educational efforts. So one of our core values, one of our guiding principles, is the commitment to the fundamental institutions of civil society that cultivate individuals capable of self-governance. So coming from our limited government viewpoint, we believe that it is individuals, communities who are best capable to find the best solutions and implement them in their communities, who are most capable of self-governing, rather than an intrusive state or federal government deciding what they think the solution should be. So it's important for us to foster those civil institutions, civil society, for that to be a possibility, because if that's not a thing, then all we have is government to come in and fix these problems, which we don't believe is the necessarily the best way to go about these issues that we're facing. But not only that, we're obviously very involved in the public discourse in Wisconsin, and we're obviously seeing a shift. Wisconsin has become quite the purple state. It's become extremely difficult to have civil conversations on these issues. And we want people as a legal and policy group to listen to what we're saying, whether or not you agree with us. We want people to have discussions with us. We want to be a part of the discourse, and we're finding that it's really difficult to do that kind of thing lately. And we felt that maybe coming to the root of what some of these problems are with our polarization and this lack of civil society, really addressing that root, trying to bring awareness to it. And our thinking is that maybe this is a way, because social capital is an undercurrent of so many issues in our society, whether you've mentioned economic inequality, crime, housing, whatever it might be. There's something to do with civil society that could be a leading factor in why some of these things are becoming problematic. So we thought that this would be an interesting lens to begin looking at some of these issues, understanding what social capital is, raising awareness of it, with the hope that this can be something that, as we continue doing our work in years to come, that this can be a way to talk about issues, to approach them in a way that isn't necessarily so ideologically charged, trying to find ways to talk about these issues in a way that everybody can hopefully agree on and have a better starting point to start addressing these things.
Great. Well, thanks for that. Aspyn and Amanda, can you tell us what you have been working on so far for the WisACT project here with Whitburn, and why?
Yeah, so for now, we've been working on a literature review to support this webinar with a more research-backed understanding of how social capital shapes specifically youth, civic, and community engagement. So the goal has been to pull together findings from a number of scholars and better understand what builds social capital, how it connects specifically to youth engagement, and where gaps may exist for certain groups of people. So this review is helping ground part of our conversation today in evidence, especially around especially around questions like which kinds of relationships, institutions, and experiences actually make a difference and whether youth get involved in their communities or not.
Are you adding anything to that, Aspyn?
No, I got the next question. We'll tackle
All right, great. One small quick thing I will add is that we're working on an effort with WisACT to develop a regional team that will start implementing some of our goals and so forth. And we definitely want to develop a focus on youth, and so grounding it in research about the relationship between youth and social capital will be important to trying to get that right. So let's turn back to Pete. What'd you find in your film?
Well, we split the film into 3 different findings. And I'll do a quick overview of what each of them were. So the first third of the film, we actually start before the bowling alone phenomenon. Robert Putnam was not originally an expert in community. He was a general political scientist. And what he happened upon, what might have become the most significant political science experiment of the last 50 years, and that led him on this quest to think about community in America. What happened was that he was in Italy at the time when Italy was transferring power from the central government to all of its regional governments. It's like if the United States never had state governments and suddenly they had 50 state governments. And what he said to himself was, this is a perfect political science experiment because we have the same starting point for all of these regional governments. Let's find out which ones succeed at governance and which ones fail, and most importantly, why. And so he did study over 20 years, and first he did all these different surveys and tests to find out which ones were the most successful governments. It turns out it was pretty consistent in almost all the tests. Regions like Emilia-Romagna in the north were the best at governance. People were happy. People felt like their government stood for them. They got things done, all the way down to Calabria and Basilicata, where the government wasn't getting anything done. If you surveyed people, they said it wasn't working out. It wasn't a successful democracy. And then he started looking into what was different about these regions up here and these regions down here. And what he found was the most significant factor was not the economy, it was not education, it was not the stability of the government, it was not urban versus rural. What it was bocce clubs and choral societies and newspaper readership and the amount of people that talked with each other in plazas and the amount of people that knew their neighbors. It was social capital, it was community. The civic culture of the region was what made the democracy work. And, then he goes into this incredible literature on social capital, which is basically, if physical capital is like a screwdriver that helps you get something done, and human capital is like going to school to learn how to use the screwdriver in the best way, social capital is the stuff that lets you get things done because you know other people and you're in relationships with each other people. It's networks of trust and reciprocity and care among each other. And what he found was that is what eventually trickles up to a functional government, but also functional all institutions. People were healthier, the kids learned more, people were happier. Your chances of dying in the next month are cut in half by joining one group. Your risk factor for dying is as big a risk factor as smoking. Social isolation is, like not being part of a club. So in all levels, it is community that makes democracy work. So that's the first finding. Second finding is he comes back to America and he's like, I want to look into what's going on with social capital in America. And what he finds is in the last 50 years, it's been going down on almost every level. 40% of Americans belong to no groups. 2/3 of Americans belong to none or only one, which is very weird. 50 years ago, it would have been normal to belong to 3 or 4 groups. The amount of picnics we're going on is down. The amount of game playing we have is down. The amount of informal dinner parties is down. The amount of people that go to town meetings or are the leader in a group or are a member of a club or, say that they trust their neighbors or trust their government, all going down. And so we're in a social recession right now that we've been sliding towards over the last 50 years, and it's only gotten worse since COVID. And so that gets into the third finding, which is we got to turn this around, and we've actually turned it around before. At different times in American history, people have woken up to a social recession and decided to get really civically creative. Let's take one example. At the turn of the 20th century, um, it is the time when 50% of all major civic groups that exist today were founded. The Boy Scouts, the Girl Scouts, public playgrounds, Mother's Day, the 4-H, the NAACP, the direct election of senators, the idea of, having public high schools was, one of the biggest community building institutions in our country. The flourishing of unions and cooperatives, the return of people to congregations, all of that happened in a 40-year period where people turned it around. And Bob's message and our message with this film is we need another civic awakening and revival today. Not necessarily joining the groups of 50 years before, though that could help, but thinking up creative new ways we can come together, and our institutions, hospitals, schools, businesses, government can open themselves up to more participation, more community building in more ways. And so we're seeing really exciting examples all around the country of the first sparks of that happening, but we need to blow on those sparks and get a wildfire of civics spanning this country if we want to get the benefits of a rich communal life.
Excellent. Thanks, Pete. Miranda, based on the research that you've worked on, why is social capital important to Wisconsin in particular? What key facts did you uncover so far?
Sure. So in our first report, we'd had a series of 3 papers. The first one was just highlighting what social capital is and giving the examples of how it affects our society and what it looks like in Wisconsin, making it feel relatable, having it be understandable, explaining it. The second one was looking at technology, as Bob Putnam said in his book, with television. And then we also talked about cell phone usage in the 21st century and how that has probably contributed to that, as well as polarization. Then the third one was looking at solutions. So in our first paper, we highlighted a couple different data sets. In 2018, the Joint Economic Committee started the Social Capital Project that was started by Senator Mike Lee from Utah. I watched this documentary last night and he was highlighted in there. Great documentary, by the way. I loved it. So in that research that they did back in 2018, they looked at 26 variables that they categorized into 7 different sub-indices. And in that data, they compared all the 50 states. Wisconsin ranks 3rd, which is obviously very good overall. But of course, I always have to have a caveat with that because it's only a comparison in that snapshot of time. That doesn't mean that Wisconsin hasn't been declining along with everyone else over the past 50 years or so. But then what was interesting about that data is that for a few of the sub-indices, they actually had county level data and were comparing counties against all other counties nationally. So that was more interesting to see a few areas where maybe Wisconsin does have areas of concern or ways to think about possibly trying to improve or issues to look at. So one of the indices they looked at was community health sub-index, which encompasses a lot of different variables, mostly having to do with how involved you are. So in the last year, have you attended a meeting about politics, participated in a demonstration, volunteered, help your neighbor fix something, things along those lines, and then the number of organizations for every 1,000 people. So in that sub-index, 9 counties in Wisconsin ranked in the middle 20%. They did it by fifths. So there's top 20, top 40, middle 20, bottom 40, bottom 20. So we were in the middle 20 for 9 of them, but the rest were all in the top 20, which is great news. The reason that those 9 states fell in the middle 20 compared to all other counties nationally was that there's fewer religious organizations and non-religious nonprofit groups. So there's fewer organizations in these counties for whatever reason. Another one was the Family Unity Sub-Index that measured percentage of births to unmarried women, women currently married, and children with a single parent. So a few counties were in the bottom 20% nationally. That was Sawyer, Forest, Menominee, and Milwaukee counties. And then there were 23 additional counties that fell in the middle 20 or bottom 40%. And then another one that we looked at that they had was collective efficacy, which is the number of violent crimes for 100,000 people. Milwaukee County was in the bottom 20%, and then Brown, Ashland, and Eyre County were in the bottom 40, and then an additional 16 counties were in the middle 20. So those are just some interesting things to kind of look at comparison, some of these variables that we're using to measure social capital and things like that. And then kind of separate from the actual social capital aspect of it, I mentioned that another thing we looked at was polarization. That's important because a big part of social capital is how much you trust your neighbors, your community, your government. And when you have distrust of all these people, that tends to lead to this higher polarization, not talking to each other, having caricatures of what you think other people think, and that kind of thing. So we found a study when looking at this connection that studied the polarization of state legislatures between 1996 and 2020. So that basically is measuring how often do people vote along their party lines and never with the other party. And Wisconsin was the 12th most polarized legislature. So I think that's really interesting. The study never really said why certain states are like that or what might cause it, but it obviously has a big impact because when states are or legislatures are more polarized, they have less capacity to get priorities finished for things to essentially get done. That leads to more distrust, more polarization. So you can see how it's kind of a never-ending cycle. So those are some of the things that, at least Wisconsin specific, that were interesting to look at with some of this data that we were pulling together for our reports.
Thanks much, Miranda. I'm going to throw a link to, we're putting a link to your reports in the chat. Amanda's doing that. And I'm also going to put a link to a report that I wrote for Whitburn Center that covers similar terrain in Wisconsin for rural Wisconsin, in case people are interested in that. But we now want to hear from Aspyn. Aspyn, what does your lit review suggest so far about social capital levels amongst U.S. youth and how that relates to their civic and community engagement?
Yeah, so the literature first addresses the obvious reduced civic and community engagement amongst young people within the past 10 to 20 years, and that a contributing factor is oftentimes that the disengagement is related to not having community building resources post-COVID-19. Obviously, with technology advancing, this has been going downhill for much longer. But there has been a dramatic increase or decrease in civic engagement and community building amongst young people since COVID. We've also found that it's affirming in the sense that youth who are encouraged to access diverse and supportive social networks are more likely to participate in civic life. Anything from just attending church every Sunday can boost your willingness to participate in your community and your government. Going to clubs at school or in university or at organizations through like the YMCA and Boys and Girls Club, they all increase a young person's willingness to be involved in their community and government. However, with that being said, multicultural and multiracial youth have disproportionate access to each of those things. And with that, there's an issue in social capital theory that we really expand on in the second half of our paper. The idea that building social capital for young people of color in the United States is the end-all or be-all solution fails to recognize the lack of access to these networks of social capital. And the fact that there's also good and bad social capital. Not all social capital is good. Some people, young people, particularly young people of color, end up finding communities that actually increase radical views and polarization, can sometimes lead to gang violence, political violence, and things like that. And in addition, the idea that there are systemic issues within our institutions that ultimately make civic and community engagement unattractive for these young people is a huge issue that we address in the second half of our literature review. So that kind of leaves us with how do we bridge this gap in young minority communities? And that's the key question that we're kind of left with after doing our lit review and some research on our own.
Excellent. Thanks, Aspyn. The rest of you can see why we're excited to have these smart young people working with us here at UW Oshkosh. And I would just mention too that I'm wearing this shirt partly because I'm in Florida with my family and drove down through Atlanta yesterday and was able to have a meeting for WisACT at the Carter Center. We've been working remotely with folks from the Carter Center on this project, and it was really cool to be able to go to Carter Center and have a meeting there. And youth development, engagement and so civic engagement and so forth was a key topic of discussion at the lunch meeting that we had. And my daughter, who's 18 and just graduated high school, has not read your lit review paper yet, Aspyn and Amanda, but she echoed some of your key findings because she was asked, well, what, as somebody that just graduated high school, what do you think about this issue of youth civic engagement? And she said that there's a distinct lack of mentorship in the institutions around her that was her take on it, that was causing people to not get involved. So and not really develop that social capital either. So just thought I'd mention that. And we're going to move to the last sort of round of discussion before we do some hopefully robust Q&A at the end here. Pete, it'd be great to hear more about, sort of the action that your film points to, and if you have some particularly interesting stories, case studies that you could mention that have inspired you from meeting people around the country. Tell us whatever you feel like in that regard. What should we do next? What examples do you have to inspire us further?
Yeah, we think about it at different levels of engagement. So at the totally individual level, like our message is right there from the start of the movie, which is, join a club. We really think, we hope that the film can be a nudge of, if you're on the line, at least try it out. Ask yourself the question, what are you doing alone that you could be doing together? The clubs as goofy. We've run into a club as goofy as the Sunday TV Club in San Francisco, where they literally were like, we're all watching TV alone on Sunday night. We might as well watch it together, which ended up becoming bigger than just a bunch of people watching TV, which is usually what clubs become. All the way up to, if you're sitting at home angry about something you're seeing on the screen in our national politics, think of if there's people that are also might be concerned about that too in your local area that can get together and, fight for something different. Next level up is we need a flourishing of people creating clubs. And we also need we got to get creative and saying, if you think there's something you want to do together, it is very likely that there are other people in your locale that also want to do it too. I kept hearing a repeating story from everyone as we travel around the country, which is, I just rose the flag out one day of putting a sign on a bulletin board or writing to the town email list or just putting an ad in the newspaper saying, does anyone want to join this? And I was shocked. Suddenly 40 people wanted to join it. People are so hungry for this. The next level up is we need cities to become great containers of civic culture. And so we're encouraging everyone to, create a community of community builders in their city that can help build civic infrastructure. So, have your city do a civic census, find out all the clubs that are in town and write them up all together into a civic directory. Look up all the meeting spaces and third spaces in town and see how many you have and write that up in a civic directory. Not only do you create this resource that shows people how much of club life is there, the act of talking to every civic group in town will help give you ideas of what's needed next to build civic culture in your town. And what's needed next might be, there should be an annual activities fair. We've seen cities do that. Just like in college or high school, they're doing it for adults in towns where everyone sets up a booth. You need robust local newspapers because local newspapers not only tell you about what's going on in a club, they also tell you that what you're doing in this town is important. And maybe we need civic development offices in towns and commissions, just like we have economic development offices. It's very similar. You're trying to attract small businesses and help them out and getting off the ground. We need to attract small clubs and help them get off the ground. Finally, at the highest level, we need all of our institutions to be thinking about ways that they can be community builders. So you think there's an institution that's not about community, like say like a daycare or something. But that's just doing a service of, providing daycare for kids. It turns out when daycares throw parties for the parents of the kids in daycare, the kids in daycare do better. When schools have PTAs, the kids do better. When hospitals have diagnosis communities where people who share a diagnosis are in groups together, those people do better. The most successful recovery community in history is a club. It's AA and 12-step programs, which are free And millions of people all across the country are meeting in AA meetings because one person named Bill W. decided to be a civic creator and start something new, let alone governments saying, let's have more boards and commissions that blur the line between who is inside the government and who is outside the government by having dozens of people be part of citizen boards and commissions for different topics around the town to help city staff and city elected officials remain close to people and bring people together onto different city initiatives, because it's not the government that does your city, it's everyone as citizens that create your city. So we need you joining clubs, we need creating clubs, we need to help create civic cultures, and we need our institutions to clubify themselves a bit by having community participation opportunities. And that's going to go a long way towards rejuvenating civics in America.
Nice. Thanks for that blueprint, Pete. Just in case people haven't read this book and might find it useful, it reminds me of Eric Kleinenberg's Palaces for the People, which focuses on the concept of social infrastructure. So that might be, if you're interested in more on this, that might be a book to get a hold of for people out there. Miranda, what key recommendations stem from your study for us here in Wisconsin?
So we looked at a bunch of different policy recommendations, things that have been proposed at different levels of government. So I'll just highlight a few of them here. So at least federally, one of the things we looked at was this idea of a universal charitable deduction. So you have your standard deduction that most people take every tax year. But then on top of that, you could have an additional charitable deduction. So in 2020 and 2021, they allowed for that additional deduction for charitable giving for $300 for individuals and $600 for joint filers. And in those 2 years, the number of $300 donations to any sort of group increased by almost 30%. So the idea there is that by encouraging charitable giving, we're hopefully empowering some of these organizations that are in communities, are community building, to be able to better do those types of things. And of course, having those people who are doing the giving to feel more connected and hopefully get involved themselves. At the state level, we found a study that published by the Philanthropy Roundtable that found that regulatory burden tends to have an impact on the number of organizations in your state. So the top 5 states with the lowest regulatory burden had 76 charities per $1 billion of GDP, and the 5 states with the highest regulatory burden averaged 59 charities per $1 billion of GDP. So we looked at a few different ways that how Wisconsin ranked on there. It sounds like we were pretty high up in startup costs, so that might be a barrier for organizations in our state to be starting and flourishing. So that's one way that states in general could be looking at supporting more civil society. And at the local level, one of the things we found is that home ownership is a huge driver in people wanting to be involved in their communities. Not only are you living there longer, ideally, or probably, so you want to be more involved, but then having a good school district, so getting involved in your PTA or being part of your local neighborhood crime watch because you want crime to go down, those things can increase your property value. So looking at ways to make home ownership more accessible and that sort of thing. One of the things that we've done research on previously is on zoning regulations. So making sure that we're not getting rid of it's called the missing middle. So things like duplexes, condos, townhomes, things that really aren't necessarily being built anymore that are more affordable and ways for people to get get their foot in the door of home ownership, allowing for things like that to happen, or even just more affordable lots. A lot of places you have to be set back a certain distance from the curb, or you have to have a certain size lot, things like that, where if you have no choice but to build on more land, you're going to build a bigger home. My parents, in preparation for this, I looked at all of the new developments happening in Delafield where my parents live. And there's 2 recent new construction projects happening in the area. All of the houses were at least $1 million, and the 3 that I could find for sale right now, they're all a half acre. They're about 4 beds, 4.5 baths. One is 1.65 million, one is 1.76, and one is 1.98 million. And these are the new builds. So it's one thing to say that we need more construction, but it's also the type of construction, because if we want young families to move into Delafield, Wisconsin, they're not going to be buying almost $2 million homes. At least probably not. I can't. So things like that, where some of these solutions at different levels of government that we can look at to kind of look at how we can get out of the way a little bit that allows civic society to flourish a little more.
Great. Well, thanks for those specific recommendations. Very interesting. Amanda, are you going to close us out with some thoughts on how we further youth engagement in civic and civil life and civil society and civic life?
Yes, so I have a few core strategies, both from the literature and from my own work as an educator. So I kind of answered this through the lens of an educator, whether that be through traditional K through 12 schools or other educational programming that organizations may run. So first, civic education needs to be interactive and relational. Programs that include discussion, reflection, and real-world issues that are relevant to young people connect civic learning to their personal lives. And then second, trusted adults matter. So this reminds me of what Paul said a bit ago. Stanton and Salazar is a scholar that talked about institutional agents and how teachers, mentors, youth workers, etc., can connect students to civic opportunities because they might not be able to find them themselves. Third, designing for equity. As Aspyn talked about, we can't assume that one size fits all civic programming will work. So we really need to design intentionally for a variety of students. As an educator, I'm interpreting this as supporting what's commonly known as like universal design for learning, culturally responsive pedagogy, and then just simple differentiation of what we are teaching youth. And then finally, recognizing the legitimacy of some of these digital and informal civil spaces. Obviously, social media is becoming increasingly popular with youth, whether that's good or bad. We still need to embrace it to some extent. So internet has changed what organizing may look like. Social media is a very powerful tool for young people and organizations alike. And I think as people from the outside and helping youth get involved, we need to recognize that social media can be a tool for youth to get involved and not necessarily the enemy. So ultimately, there are a lot of strategies here, and we just need to make sure that we're meeting youth where they are, and then advocating for them when they are in these groups that may not have the opportunities that all groups have, and support them with structures that are reflecting their lived reality and what they are interested in.
I would also like to just briefly echo what Pete Davis was saying about institutions having a responsibility to help facilitate community building. Something that we found a lot of is that African American communities are more likely to have trusting and positive relationships with police when law enforcement actually gets out there and participates in, Christmas parades or other activities going on in the community. So we need to make sure that we're not putting all of the responsibility and burden on education and these marginalized communities themselves, but also putting some responsibility on institutional leaders to reach out and bridge this gap.
Great point. Thanks to you both. And thanks to all our panelists. Excellent stuff. Let's give them a hand, whether that's a virtual hand or a real hand like I'm doing. We really appreciate you being here, and as a stimulating conversation for me, at least. I hope it was for other people too. And now we'd like to give people the opportunity to join the conversation. We have 12 minutes, which isn't too bad to do a little Q&A. Does anybody have a question that they would like to ask of our panelists? You can feel free to put it in the chat or unmute yourself and just ask the question.
I have a question.
Let's hear it, Beth.
I'm just wondering, and Aspyn touched on this a little bit, but I'm wondering if you still build the same type of social capital if you're doing things like joining online groups versus in-person groups.
So something that I found is that it is useful. I haven't gone super deep into research done during COVID. That's something that I'd like to do probably in my next steps. But even during COVID-19, the use of like chat groups and social media did have, to an extent, a positive influence. However, it's hard to moderate these types of forums. So it also allows in for a lot of misinformation, a lot of radical, on both sides kind of media without a lot of moderation for young people. And there's still not that level of face-to-face engagement that helps bridge that divide. So in some ways it's positive, but it's still also extremely helpful to have that in-person facilitated conversation and dialogue and community organizing.
If
I
I could
also-
add,
Oh, sorry.
Oh, sorry. Oh, no, you go first. That was
Okay,
great.
I just had a little bit to add to that. Most of the research that I did the reading on, it talked about like social media more as a medium to expose youth to opportunities, not necessarily to be the opportunity itself. So this is like suggesting like organizations should do a better job at advertising their events online, and that's how youth can get involved and then go do it in person, not necessarily have all the involvement online. I also kind of wonder if it's different for people who have grown up with using the internet their entire lives and it's just their reality. Because for all of us, it's not just completely our reality. So I'm not sure if that affects things, but it's a question that I do wonder.
That's what I was gonna say is that in our second report, we talked a lot about social media and the use of Facebook groups and things along those lines, and that was our conclusion was that it's good to have those those online mediums as long as there's an in-person component as well, and it's not completely online.
And then it looked like Pete was going to say something too.
Yeah, I'll just add, one of the ways to think about this is to break down what you get out of a relationship. So a relationship does a lot of things. So when we say social capital, one fuzzy way to say it is it's just a collection of relationships. Relationships are things that bring you soup when you're sick, that inform you, that entertain you, that are a place where you can have hard conversations together, that are places where you can laugh together, that are places where you can get together and fight City Hall, that are places where you can get together and clean up the park, that are people who drive you to a doctor's appointment and grieve with you and celebrate with you, that you tell your hopes to and your fears to. Internet spaces and internet relationships do some of those things. They obviously entertain you. They obviously inform you. But the critical question you have to ask yourself is Joe Rogan or Rachel Maddow or the YouTube streamer that you're following, do they bring you soup when you're sick? Do the other people that are in the Taylor Swift fan community or the subreddit that you follow and get a kick out of every day, are they people that you share your darkest fears with and then they comfort you and drive you to the doctor's appointment? Are they people that you are getting together in a routine way to go do civic challenges together, whether it's volunteering or, doing civic reform? If they are doing all of that, I'm not going to critique internet relationships, but I would ask everyone to be very honest with yourselves about if that is actually happening. And if it's not, there is always in-person communities that are there to do it. We had some of the largest internet-driven political movements in the last 6 years. But those people were not who were showing up to giant rallies, who were posting wildly, who were watching cable news, who were following the right podcasts or YouTube, but they were not showing up to weekly Thursday night meetings. And the entirety of American history, plus the entirety of the things that you look back on when you're on your deathbed and think of as the great times in your life, occur in routine in-person meetings. And so if it's really replacing that, that's great, not going to be a Luddite, but I'd really ask if it's really doing that. What we found when we did the archival research for Join or Die was we found a lot of photos of people at Thursday night meetings. The Thursday night meeting is what built America, or whatever night, the monthly meeting or whatever. You look at the opening chapter of Stride Toward Freedom, which is Martin Luther King's memoir of the Montgomery bus boycott. And what you find is that it's an account of dozens of Thursday night meetings. It's the meeting of his church. It's the meeting of all the other churches. It's the meeting of the pastor association. It's the meeting of the bricklayers union. It's the meeting of the women's political committee. It's the meeting of the local NAACP where Rosa Parks was secretary of the local, executive secretary of the local NAACP. They were all, and then when the boycott started, they were having beautiful Sunday meetings where they were singing and planning and doing phone trees. That is what led to one of the largest changes in the 20th century. And we have to be really real with ourselves on if we're making progress in those, if expression and awareness raising and informing oneself is actually moving the ball forward on the different causes that we care about, including the deeply personal causes of just having a good year. in our lives. So that's the challenge I would give on internet relationships.
Excellent. It looks like Ariel in the chat is seconding some of what you're saying there. Gabe asks, and then Mike Patton, I see your hand up, so we'll go to you after Gabe's question in the chat. Does anyone have a favorite club that more people should know about? Anybody have a favorite club that you want to share a little bit more about?
I'll go. So the National Organization for Women recently formed a chapter in Appleton about a year ago, I want to say. And they're actually quite big. They're growing really quickly, which is awesome. But we have not had a National Organization for Women chapter since the 70s. So it's just really great to see that they've reformed and they're doing very, very well, which is awesome. And they're doing work all across Wisconsin, but primarily in the Fox Valley.
Thanks, Amanda. Anybody else have one to share?
I'll just share that, I'll share two examples. One is there's a CrossFit gym in Brooklyn that decided to follow the needs of its members beyond their original mission, which I just love. So they start as a CrossFit gym and they're like, everyone wants to exercise. We're going to be a CrossFit gym. We'll follow the CrossFit procedures. But then they noticed that a lot of their members were in recovery. And so they started a South Brooklyn CrossFit gym meeting, 12 steps meeting. And they did that. And then they noticed that a lot of their members were into stand-up comedy. And now they have a monthly South Brooklyn CrossFit gym stand-up showcase. And then they started noticing all their members wanted to watch movies together. And now they do a South Brooklyn CrossFit gym movie night, every so often. And so I am really into the idea of you start a group for one reason, but then you stay close to your members and you allow yourself to get weird and different. So that's one story. The second story I'll just share is really simple sparks can make a huge difference. I'm a young parent right now. There might be some young parents in the audience. I stand at the playground with my toddler and don't talk to the other dads. And we just kind of stand there awkwardly watching our toddlers. In Oakland, someone reached out to us and they said they got sick of doing that at the playground. And one day they decided to buy 8 pizzas, put them out on a table, and hang up a sign that said, "This is now a pizza party at the playground. We're not going to stand awkwardly anymore." And they handed out name tags and they all ate pizza. And now they do it weekly and they trade off. And now everyone pays for the pizza. They had to do a little bit of an investment up front of like getting people trusting it. And now it's no longer a playground. It's a weekly pizza party. And so I would that is such a great example of asking the question, what are you doing alone that you could be doing together? I was standing alone, just watching my kid, but there's all these other parents there in a similar situation as me. And one little change can turn that into a proto club. And so I just encourage everyone to take that spirit of what are you doing alone that you could be doing together, and one little act of bravery can really turn something into something.
Thanks, Pete. That's great. And we have a couple other examples in the chat that I will encourage you to look at. Michael Patton, what's your question?
Yeah, I work at the Titan takeoff days in the morning, and hey, Amanda, how you doing? And we tell these incoming students we have between 120 and 140 clubs here at UW Oshkosh, and yet my experience with some of them is there will be 2 people show up, 3 people show up, 5 people do all the work. How do we take what Pete is talking about and really turn it into communities? I know people have their areas of interest, and then that appeals to other people, but it seems so niche. How do we make things bigger than 5 people at a time?
That's kind of the big question, isn't it? Any particular examples from your work, Pete, stand out from the examples?
Yeah, I'll say 2 things. One is the art of club building is a craft. It is something that we can get better at, and it's something that we can share best practices with. And so I'd highly recommend, Priya Parker's The Art of Gathering, or Jane McAlevy's No Shortcuts, or Hari Han's How Organizations Develop Activists, or John McKnight's The Abundant Community. And there's all this, and we're working really hard to try to build up like different reading lists to hone the craft of organizing people. You know, different tips like how do you run a good meeting? How do you involve more people in the workings of the club? So the number one correlate with whether someone's going to be active in a club a year from when they joined is if they have an early experience of agency, if they have an early experience of being in the leadership of the club. So the clubs where a small number of people lead and tell everyone what to do usually fizzle out. A club where even if it would be less efficient to ask the newbie to help plan a meeting because they don't know how to plan a meeting yet, they don't know where the chairs go or how to book the room, asking them to plan the meeting and have the slightly less efficient meeting but slightly higher participation is the type of investment in the future leadership and participation of your club. That's one thing. Second thing I'll say is we need to have a civic culture larger than just a club. And that's why I strongly encourage towns to start clubs of club leaders. Just like there's a chamber of commerce, we need a chamber of community. Just like how there's an economic development office, we need a civic development office. What are the things that they do? We need activities fairs. We need club directories. We need local newspapers. We need parades to celebrate club life. We need awards to give out to the best club in town, because the award's not about the person you give it to. The award's about everyone else in the audience that says, oh, wow, we celebrate this in our town. And like, that's something worth doing. And we need times where club leaders are meeting up and saying, oh God, I just had another meeting and no one showed up. What do you do? And then, or I just had another meeting and we figured out how to get people to show up. Let me tell you about it. And clubs partnering together. And so it's not just about clubs, it's about local civic cultures. That is what Putnam studied. You know, that's what he said, like the region that had high social capital, another way to put that is they had a civic culture. They had public life that had a lot of things going on where a lot of people were connected. And so I would encourage the club leaders who are struggling to get together with other club leaders who are struggling and create a meta club. Because y'all will, just like how different pastors get together, different business leaders get together and share tips and tricks.
That's excellent. Well, we are out of time. I want to say thanks again to Pete, Miranda, Aspyn, and Amanda, and for all of you for being here. Really enjoyable conversation. For people in Wisconsin, and if you're not already a member of WisACT, you may not even know what WisACT is. But I think Amanda is going to share the membership link. One of the things we're trying to do with WisACT is just to get people to join, and what that essentially means is that you're committing to some core principles of bipartisanship and having fruitful conversations and getting involved. That's really all it means to join, but that will mean also that you'll start getting our newsletters and hear about things like this and other opportunities to get actively involved in the efforts that we're engaged in. We do this monthly too, by the way, so this is a really awesome one. We're planning another one for July that should be really exciting. We'll have more information about that out to you soon. So thanks again, everybody. And what was it that made me really smile earlier, Pete? Something about turning it into a wildfire. Maybe you could just recap that as we go.
You know, we gotta blow on the sparks of civic
That's
life
it.
and turn it into wildfire. Yeah. We want a slightly less dangerous metaphor is we gotta sing all these little green sprouts and spread the garden wider. So
there you go. And that connects to the Wisconsin Farmers Union that my friend Sarah Lloyd mentioned there. So excellent. Thanks, everybody. Enjoy the rest of your week.
Thank y'all.